Hello and welcome. My name is Vivienne. I'm gonna unpack some statements that I've heard in the general voice world, or I've often heard from clients who think these things or have been confused by them at some point when approaching singing voice transition. And many of these things aren't necessarily specific to trans people in voice transition, but a lot of them are very related to the whole process and come up very often. I don't really know why I decided to make this a tier list, but here we are. So I'm gonna be placing all the statements into the categories, "That's actually true," "Okay, but," "I'm gonna say no," or "This is baloney." Let's get started. Your physiology affects how your voice sounds. I'm gonna place this in "okay, but." There is no doubt that things like your vocal fold mass, vocal fold length, vocal tract volume, etc. affect the function and thus the sound of your voice. But this statement becomes a lot more inaccurate when we conceptualize it as your physiology determines the way your voice sounds, because that's not true. It may impose certain limits, but even within that context, generally speaking, the amount of things that any voice in healthy condition is capable of is absolutely massive.
If I always spoke like this 24/7 around everyone I know, they would associate this sound with what they would recognize as my voice. It would eventually become behaviorally familiar to me, and I would eventually start to do it without thinking about it. And even to me, with enough time, this would become my voice. But that isn't at all a reflection of my physiology. It's just a reflection of what I'm doing with it. This is such an important point to understand when it comes to singing, because I've heard so many people, both cis and trans, say things like, "Oh, I'm not a belter," or "I can't sing that genre," or "I can't sing runs," or "I'm not really a solo singer, I don't really have a good solo voice." And if you're saying any of those things about yourself, then it's likely that you might need to do some specific training and exploration and practice to learn how to do those things, because they're just not what you're used to doing with your voice. But that is so different from saying that you physically can't do them, because in so many cases, you probably can. Range is fixed and unchangeable. I'm gonna drag this straight into "this is baloney." This is like saying that someone who can only lift up to 50 pounds at a current point in their life could never lift any more than that. And sure, maybe if they don't do anything at all to change that, that could be true. But if they consistently exercise relevant muscle groups, they'll get stronger and their abilities will change over time. And that's not to mention that they may not have been using the relevant muscle groups in the most efficient way possible to begin with. This isn't super different from voice. The way that we make sound revolves around the action of tiny muscle groups, and bearing in mind some physical limitations, they can gradually and generally adapt to demand and be trained to do lots of different things over time. In choirs, I used to primarily sing bass 2, and I never thought I'd be able to even sing tenor, but now alto or mezzo soprano is most comfortable in those kinds of settings. And I can't even sing bass 2 anymore because I've lost a considerable portion of my low range simply because I just don't use it anymore. So much of what we can do with our voices revolves around the idea of behavioral reinforcement. So to think that range is unchangeable is just not accurate. Transfemme singers should avoid mode 2 or falsetto to sound more feminine. I'm gonna say no. Okay, common scenario. A transfemme singer is working on developing their upper range and they say, there's something I don't really like about it. I can hit all the notes, but it just sounds too falsetto-y. Because of that impression, some people come to the conclusion that the problem is that it's too light, is that it's mode 2 or head voice, and the solution is to take this heavy modal chest voice kind of quality and force it really high instead. When people say this, I do usually understand what they mean. Usually they're looking for a sound that has more body or fullness to it, more presence or brightness or shimmering, but often trouble comes when people associate light vocal production with falsetto, or at least
a falsetto-y kind of sound, as if those are the same thing. This could easily be a whole video in and of itself, and it's easy to get stuck in the weeds about terminology, but usually I find that when people describe falsetto, they're describing a combination of things that make up a perceptual construct. It's not just head voice or mode 2. It's a recipe involving a light vocal production, relatively large vocal tract size, noticeable amounts of breathiness, things like that. It's a specific concoction or a combination of things that sounds hollow or weak or dull to people, but changing a few of those elements, like reducing size in the mouth or throat, or decreasing breathiness, or adding some volume or a bit of weight, can make a sound that's still pretty light not sound like falsetto at all anymore. Though it depends on the stylistic context and what kind of sound you're ultimately going for, starting with a light head voice like type of vocalization can actually be an incredibly versatile base and a really useful starting place for working through one's upper range in a way that many people often overlook. Transmasculine singers should not practice singing while their voices are changing because of HRT. This is baloney. If you've never heard this one, I'm super happy for you. This is something that I've often heard through the grapevine from wary choir directors and voice teachers who are worried about transmasc singers hurting their voices while they're changing. And it's usually because they just don't know what to expect or how the process works, and it seems like some kind of magic. Cis teenage guys go through puberty all the time and they do not stop using their voices to sing. This is just not something we tell people to do. It can be hard and feel awkward to navigate singing, but it is not inherently dangerous to do when on T. Of course, no one should push their voices past limits of fatigue or strain, or train intensively through discomfort, but this guideline applies to everyone always. If you're concerned you have some kind of voice pathology, you should see if you can see a relevant professional for consultation if you're able to, but as a blanket rule, banning singing during voice change does not check out. Voice breaks always happen at a specific note in someone's voice. I'm gonna say no. This is sort of related to some of the earlier points about physiology and flexibility, but it also has to do with more than that. There are two general categories of reasons for a voice break happening. One is physical, where one component or some of the components of a system of voice change too suddenly, like when someone glides from a low note to a high note, and at some point, the amount of weight shifts dramatically instead of gradually. The second is acoustic. The acoustics of the vocal tract, or the shape and the amount of space in the mouth and the throat, can interfere with the oscillation of the vocal folds as we're making sound. This can happen in a positive way. It makes singing a certain note feel really good and effortless, or in a deconstructive way where it results in a voice break. It's a feedback loop inherent to the system related to the idea of acoustic inertance. And if you've ever heard of the idea of formant tuning, this relates to that. If all of this sounds totally foreign to you, don't worry about it at all. The point is, something like the shape of your mouth when singing a certain note can affect whether or not you'll come across a voice break or not. And good news, you can change the shape of your mouth. There are all kinds of things that can influence where passaggi or voice breaks happen. I'm not putting this one in this is baloney because yes, there are physiological factors that are predictors of where passaggi are likely to occur. And if you're singing through a part of your range in just about the same way every time, you'll probably find a predictable voice break in the same place every time. But there are a ton of things you can do to work around these and shift where those are happening in your voice. Countertenor is a voice type. This is baloney. For those who haven't heard this term before, countertenor is an umbrella label sometimes used to describe an AMAB singer who performs a certain style of high range, usually classical singing. Many Transfemme singers might not identify with this label because to a lot of people it's just very gendered. I bring it up because there's a common misconception that people who sing countertenor are exceptions to some kind of rule, who somehow inherently have a very high range because their voice has just developed that way, and this is typically not true. Most people who sing countertenor simply learn the technique to use their voice in this way, and most of them could very well sing tenor or baritone or bass. There generally isn't a physiological barrier to entry to learning how to sing in this way. Most AMAB folks could do it if they just dedicated themselves to it. If anything, I hope that the long history of performing countertenors serves as a motivating example that voices are often capable of so much more than societal expectation often leads us to believe. Wrapping up with 2 bonus points that really aren't trans voice specific, but I still think are worth mentioning. I should drink water to help me sing is actually true. Being hydrated can be very helpful for stamina and voice quality generally. But I do want to note that when you drink water, it doesn't make direct contact with your vocal folds, so it doesn't immediately hydrate them. It requires anywhere from 40 to 80 minutes or more for it to process through the body. So if you expect to be doing lots of singing, consider staying hydrated before instead of chugging a ton of water immediately before your first note. And lastly, if I'm a good singer, I shouldn't get tired or need breaks. This is baloney. Every singer needs breaks and rest time, especially if you're getting used to using your voice in a new way. If you feel fatigue, please listen to your body and try not to take it personally. Long-term gains just take time and patience. Never forget to practice self-care along your vocal journey. And there you have it. With that, our tier list is complete. Thanks for tagging along, and I'll see you next time.